Do you know that American schools teach both black and white children a distorted version of the transatlantic slave trade's history? People are claiming that Africans benefited from the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade, also known as the Atlantic slave trade and the triangular trade. About 240 years ago, Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, asserted that his white masters taught black African slaves craft art. This helps you understand what he meant. People were proud to say this because they made up the story that enslaving black people was actually a way for white people to help them. American schools teach the story of the maritime slave trade in the same way. This not only instills hatred in young people, but it also instills in them a disdain for the fact that black people were once slaves, subjected to exploitation akin to animals. Others may exploit them for profit, abuse them, or kill them. Is there a hidden agenda behind encouraging young students to disregard others, instead of talking about how guilty white people are? How do schools work to legitimize and defend the international slave trade? Let's see the uncensored version of the transatlantic slave trade in this video. This is the side of the story that schools never teach. The Office of Black History. Now let's begin. From the early 1600s to the late 1800s, the Atlantic slave trade was a terrible way to take advantage of people, and it forced over 12 million Africans to leave their homes. The Americas and Europe took these people against their will and treated them with unimaginable violence. During the Middle Passage alone, an estimated 2.75 million Africans lost their lives due to sickness, hunger, or fighting. Contrary to what you learn in school, the captured Africans were not slaves in Africa. They were normal people who worked as farmers, artisans, merchants, and soldiers, and prospered in their towns. However, a recurrent myth based on racism says that Africans were naturally successful at being slaves. This story has come up again in modern times. In a speech on July 21, 2023, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said that slavery helped some Africans learn skills like blacksmithing. These arguments in favor of Florida's new educational standards employ the same logic that supported slavery hundreds of years ago. The offensive thought that Africans who were slaves had chances to get better at life is both false and offensive. In his notes on the state of Virginia from 1785, Thomas Jefferson had similar ideas. He asserted that teaching Africans trades by their white masters would benefit them. However, historical proof goes against these stories. Several hundred Africans came with unique skills. According to historian Michael W. Twitty, plantation owners especially looked for Africans who knew how to grow rice because Europeans didn't know how to do it. Similarly, African ironworkers from West and West Central Africa possessed exceptional skills prior to their forced labor as slaves. The Florida curriculum ignores these facts, perpetuating a distorted history that diminishes the humanity of African people. Slavery started with violent captures in Africa, which were often made easier by people in the area working with the slavers in return for goods from Europe. Prisoners endured appalling conditions at coastal forts as they awaited their transportation. Subsequently, they boarded ships and embarked on the Middle Passage, an incredibly harrowing journey. In The Slave Ship, A Human History, Marcus Rediker describes how Africans taken as slaves found themselves chained together on dark, airless decks, crammed so close together they could not move. Dysentery, smallpox, and scurvy spread quickly because people didn't clean up after themselves. Many of the prisoners succumbed to illness, hunger, or beatings, while others chose to jump off the ship as a symbol of resistance or despair. The Middle Passage claimed the lives of about 15% to 25% of the prisoners. Even though these horrible things happened and were well recorded, educational standards like Florida's did not fully show how horrible these voyages were. Instead, they discussed topics such as slave revolts and the Underground Railroad, neglecting to acknowledge the role of structural violence in these acts of resistance. But how did it all start? European colonists sought to utilize the agricultural potential of their colonies, thereby increasing the demand for slave labor in the Americas. Initially, farmers forced native people to work as slaves, but the violence of conquest and the spread of European diseases killed off most of the original people, so colonizers moved to Africa. Portugal and Spain were the first countries to trade slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. King Charles V authorized the transfer of 4,000 Africans to Spanish colonies in 1518. People said that these acts were chances for Africans to become Christians, but the real reason was money. According to Eric Williams, The colonial economies relied on Africans held as slaves for growth, particularly in the production of sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The triangle trade system kept the Atlantic slave trade going, which exploited people over and over again. In exchange for European goods like guns and textiles, the Americas brought slaves from Africa to work on plantations. Sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations forced them to work, producing raw materials that Europe used to industrialize and build wealth. Please support our efforts by subscribing to our channel and liking the video. This neighborhood needs your help to become stronger. Let's move on now. Europe and the Americas did well, but Africa suffered terrible losses. Walter Rodney says in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa that the trade took away the continent's most skilled people, which made it less crowded and slowed down its economic growth. However, current lessons often overlook the destruction of Africa's economy. Instead, they focus on how Europe and the Americas benefited. However, the Florida State Board of Education stated that slavery was similar to indentured servitude, making this historical period more difficult to comprehend. Unlike indentured workers, Africans who were slaves were treated like property and were forced to work for free their whole lives. In 1845, Douglass penned his autobiography, criticizing the notion of the joyful slave as a tool to dehumanize slaves. Modern lessons continue to perpetuate these narratives, preventing students from comprehending the ongoing impact of slavery and institutional racism on society. By the 1820s, there were many more African slaves crossing the Atlantic than Europeans. 4 out of 5 African slaves were women. The magnitude of this trade demonstrates the avarice of those involved, who viewed people's lives as commodities for purchase and sale. This system, which sowed white dominance into the very fabric of the country, intentionally fostered racist ideas. An unfortunate part of American history, slavery was the main cause of the Civil War. The Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC report, reveals that U.S. classrooms often obscure or ignore these crucial facts. The SPLC study reveals that American schools often teach slavery in a fragmented and overly emotional manner. According to Maureen Costello, who oversees the SPLC's Teaching Tolerance Project, students frequently learn about the greatness of abolitionists, such as Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth, before learning about the harsh realities of slavery. Many children don't encounter the horrific realities of slavery until they reach the 4th or 5th grade. And even then, educators often dilute the information to prevent emotional distress. This broken-up approach fits with a bigger story in American education that sees the country's history as a steady march toward progress. The SPLC's conclusions come from a thorough study of state standards, polls of students and teachers, and inspections of high school history books. The report employs 10 key concepts developed by scholar Ira Berlin to demonstrate the detrimental teaching of slavery. These ideas include how important slavery was to the economy, how the Constitution protects it, and how it left behind a legacy of white racism. The study reveals a tendency to downplay or ignore the violence black slaves and their families endured, thereby depriving students of a comprehensive understanding of the institution's severity. People often perceive slavery as a Southern issue, despite its significant economic and legal impacts across the nation. Also, the part that white racism played in supporting and continuing slavery isn't talked about very often, which means that students don't get the background information they need to understand its lasting effects. Did you learn about the global slave trade and slavery in school or college? Or were you shocked when you discovered them yourself? What is your perspective on the notion that we, as a black community, should share the truth and educate about black history in the room below? We are striving to accomplish this, and we require your assistance in doing so. For more interesting facts about black history, look at the suggested video on the screen. Give the video a like and a subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.